It all started on a mild Saturday morning when I decided to finally replace the rusted chain and padlock on my front gate. My property sat on the edge of the Willow Creek Estates, a neighborhood notorious for its homeowners association drama and self-appointed enforcers who seemed to think they had authority over everyone's lives. I had lived there for almost 5 years, and during that time, I'd managed to keep my head down, pay my dues, and avoid unnecessary conflict. But things changed when the Johnsons moved in across the street. Mrs. Johnson, or Karen, as the entire block quietly called her, was the walking definition of entitlement. Her son, Tyler, a 19-year-old with more attitude than sense, followed in her footsteps, often parking in front of my driveway or cutting across my property like it was a public shortcut. At first, I ignored it, but when I caught Tyler driving his ATV across my lawn, leaving tire marks on the grass I'd work hard to maintain, I'd had enough. I installed a new reinforced gate, complete with a digital lock. It wasn't connected to the HOA or community system. It was purely mine, controlling my own driveway and property entrance. Within an hour of installing it, Karen was already outside, arms folded, watching me like a hawk. "You can't just block off the street entrance like that," she snapped as though she were the mayor of the block. I reminded her that it wasn't a street, it was my private driveway, part of my deeded land. She scoffed, muttered something about neighborhood cohesion, and stomped away. I didn't think much of it until later that evening when I heard yelling outside. Peeking through my blinds, I saw Tyler standing at my gate, shaking it violently while shouting, "Open the gate! I'm trying to drive through." I went out and told him calmly that this wasn't a public road, and he needed to go around like everyone else. That's when he said the line that made me realize how warped their sense of entitlement truly was. "My mom says this gate violates community access laws. You're blocking freedom of movement." I almost laughed, thinking it was a joke, but he was dead serious. When I refused to open the gate, he stormed off. 20 minutes later, flashing blue and red lights appeared outside my home. My jaw dropped. Tyler had actually called the police on me for locking my own gate. As the officers approached, I stepped outside, trying to maintain composure. "Sir," one of them said carefully, "we received a report of someone being unlawfully detained behind a locked gate." I blinked, completely dumbfounded. "You mean my gate? On my property?" The younger officer glanced awkwardly at his partner. "That's what the caller said, claims you locked a community access road and refused to open it." I shook my head in disbelief and showed them the property lines on my deed, along with the clear private drive sign I'd had up for years. The senior officer sighed, clearly realizing what had happened. "Looks like a misunderstanding. You're within your rights." But before they could leave, Karen herself came storming out of her house, waving her phone like a sword. "He's lying," she shrieked. "That gate cuts off access to the walking path. It's a safety hazard. What if there's an emergency?" The officers tried to explain that my gate didn't connect to any public right-of-way, but she wasn't having it. "I'll take this up with the HOA board," she screamed, glaring at me like I'd just stolen her crown jewels. The police, visibly annoyed, left without incident, but I knew this wouldn't be the end. HOA Karen didn't lose gracefully, and something told me she'd make it her personal mission to make my life miserable over that gate. What I didn't realize was just how far she and her spoiled son were willing to go to prove their false sense of authority. The next week, the real chaos began. I woke up early Monday morning to the sound of hammers, voices, and the unmistakable whine of a drill outside my window. When I stepped out onto my porch, coffee mug in hand, my blood pressure spiked at what I saw. 3 HOA maintenance workers were standing at my gate, tools scattered everywhere, as one of them attempted to remove the lock I had just installed. "Hey!" I shouted, storming down the driveway. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of them, a middle-aged man with a clipboard and a guilty look, mumbled, "We were told by the HOA president to replace this gate lock with a standard-issue community one." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "This isn't HOA property," I said, jabbing my finger toward the ground. "You're trespassing." He hesitated, flipping through his paperwork before muttering, "Mrs. Johnson said this area was common access. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Mrs. Johnson doesn't own this land, and she's not on the property deed. You all need to leave now. I pulled out my phone and began recording, capturing their confused expressions as I cited my property lines. They backed off, eventually muttering something about getting clarification. But it didn't take long for Karen to make her next move. That evening, a notice appeared taped to my front door, a violation of HOA code letter. According to the letter, my gate restricted community accessibility and created a potential safety hazard. I nearly tore it in half from frustration. My property had been mine long before the HOA expanded its reach. I had opted out of the association when the neighborhood formed years ago, and it was clearly stated in the county records. Yet somehow, they were now claiming authority over my land. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to clear things up once and for all. When I arrived at the community hall that Wednesday, every eye in the room turned toward me. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that made you feel like a defendant walking into a courtroom. Karen sat at the front table, her arms crossed triumphantly, flanked by her cronies, other HOA board members who hung onto her every word. Mr. Rogers, she said with mock politeness, so glad you could join us. We've been discussing your recent actions. I sat down, crossing my arms. If by actions you mean locking my own gate, then yes, I'm here to set the record straight. She leaned forward, her smile tight and condescending. You see, your gate happens to sit on a pathway many residents have used for years. Blocking it creates unnecessary division and violates our community values. Community values? I repeated, barely containing my disbelief. That pathway exists only because your son kept trespassing. It's private land. I have the deed right here. I pulled out a copy and slid it across the table. Karen glanced at it briefly, her smirk faltering for a split second before she recovered. Well, we'll have to verify that with our legal team, she said dismissively. In the meantime, we're issuing a fine of $250 for noncompliance. The room buzzed with murmurs. A few of the quieter residents looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing how wrong this was. I stood up, folding the paper and stuffing it back into my jacket pocket. You can issue whatever fine you want, I said coolly. It won't hold up in court, and if any of you step foot on my land again, I'll call the police for trespassing. Karen's face flushed bright red. This isn't over, she hissed. And she was right, it wasn't. 2 days later, I came home to find my trash cans knocked over, the side of my mailbox dented, and the gate smeared with what looked like mud or something worse. I knew immediately who had done it. I checked my security camera footage, and sure enough, there was Tyler smirking at the camera before flipping it off. I called the police, filed a vandalism report, and handed over the footage. They promised to look into it, but I knew better than to expect much. The Johnsons were experts at manipulating situations, and Karen's friendship with a local councilwoman didn't help. So, instead of waiting for justice, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Legally, I went to the county records office and pulled every document I could find on my property lines, the HOA's charter, and their jurisdiction boundaries. The more I read, the more I realized just how overreaching they were. The HOA had extended its claim common area boundaries years ago, illegally, without proper landowner consent. My property wasn't just outside their authority, it was proof of their fraud. Armed with paperwork, photos, and footage, I sent a formal notice to the HOA board and their legal representative, demanding that they cease any action or contact regarding my gate or face a lawsuit for harassment and unlawful interference with private property. For a few days, things went quiet. Karen's car didn't appear in front of my house. Tyler didn't storm the gate. Even the HOA board seemed eerily silent. But peace never lasted long with her around. The calm broke one evening when I saw flashing lights again, this time 2 police cruisers right in front of my gate. I went outside, expecting to explain the same situation again, but this time, the officer's expression was far more serious. Sir, he said, we received reports that you've installed a locked gate blocking community members from leaving the area during an emergency. My patience snapped. Emergency? What emergency? He pointed toward the Johnson house, where Karen and Tyler stood on the porch, feigning distress. They claimed someone could have been trapped behind the gate during a neighborhood evacuation drill. I shook my head incredulously. It's a private gate, not an escape route. There's no law against it. The officer sighed, clearly caught in the middle. We'll file a report, but just a heads up, the HOA might escalate this. I looked past him at Karen, who gave me a smug, knowing smile. She thought she'd won again, but this time, she had no idea what was coming. Because the next step wasn't just about defending my property, it was about exposing every illegal move she and her precious HOA had made, and I was going to do it publicly, where she couldn't hide behind her fake smiles and board meetings. By the time the third police visit had come and gone, I realized I couldn't just keep reacting to Karen's antics. I needed to go on offense. That night, sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of documents, I began assembling what could only be described as a war file. I had property deeds, boundary maps from a county surveyor, HOA bylaws, and even emails from the HOA board I'd requested through public record. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. I discovered that 5 years ago, when Willow Creek Estates expanded, the HOA had quietly redrawn their jurisdiction map, extending common area boundaries into properties that were never part of the association, mine included. It was subtle, buried in paperwork most residents never saw, but it was illegal. My address had been listed under HOA oversight, even though my deed explicitly stated I was exempt from all community covenants. That meant every fine, every letter, and every attempt to enforce compliance was an act of harassment. Armed with evidence, I contacted a real estate attorney named Jennifer Hall, a calm, sharp-minded woman who specialized in HOA abuse cases. After hearing my story, she said simply, "Mr. Rogers, you're sitting on a gold mine of leverage. We drafted a cease and desist letter citing violations of private property rights, misrepresentation of authority, and harassment." I watched her hit send with a small but satisfying click. "Give them 72 hours," she said confidently, "and they'll either back down or dig themselves deeper." Sure enough, it only took 48. That Friday, while I was mowing the lawn, a shiny black SUV pulled up to my gate. Out stepped Karen, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a manila envelope like it was a weapon. "You think you can threaten me with lawyers?" she snapped, her voice dripping venom. I shut off the mower and walked toward the gate, deliberately calm. "It's not a threat," I said evenly. "It's a warning. Stay off my property." She thrust the envelope toward me through the bars of the gate. "You're being fined again," she sneered, "for unapproved construction of a security barrier." The HOA board voted unanimously. I couldn't help it. I laughed. "You can't fine me, Karen. I'm not under your HOA jurisdiction. Your whole claim is invalid." Her smirk faltered, but she tried to regain control. "We'll see about that in court," she said, spinning on her heel and storming back to her car. I took the envelope inside, opened it, and found the so-called fine notice, now up to $1,000 for continued noncompliance. I added it to my growing stack of evidence. That weekend, I decided to hit back harder. With Jennifer's help, I filed a formal complaint with the County Zoning Commission and the State HOA Regulatory Board, attaching proof of boundary tampering and unlawful enforcement actions. Jennifer also drafted a civil harassment claim, naming both the HOA and Karen Johnson personally. I posted a summary of my experience on the neighborhood's online forum, complete with the legal documents showing my exemption from the HOA. The response was immediate and explosive. Dozens of homeowners commented, many saying they too had been fined or intimidated by Karen over questionable rules. Some even shared screenshots of similar letters that had no legal standing. Within hours, the thread had over 200 comments, and residents were demanding a special meeting to review the HOA's practices. Karen tried to delete the post, claiming it violated community harmony guidelines, but it was too late. The damage was done. By Monday morning, my gate had become the quiet center of a small revolution. Neighbors I barely knew started stopping by to thank me for standing up. "We've all been afraid to push back," one man told me. She runs this place like a dictatorship. Another neighbor confided that Karen had fined her for painting her mailbox the wrong shade of brown. It was absurd, but it showed how much power she'd assumed and how much people had tolerated out of fear. The next HOA meeting was a disaster, for her anyway. I didn't even need to speak. The residents did it for me. One by one, they confronted her with complaints, asking why fines were issued without due process and why she acted without board approval. The once confident queen of Willow Creek looked visibly shaken for the first time. When I finally stood up and presented copies of my property deed and the official county boundary map, the room fell silent. My land is not part of Willow Creek Estates. I said clearly, that gate is mine. Every violation letter you've sent me is illegal. And unless this stops, I will sue every one of you responsible. Karen's face turned crimson. This is slander, she shouted, but no one backed her up. Even the HOA president looked away. After that meeting, things got quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the uneasy calm of waiting for her next move. It was the silence of defeat. For a few days, I almost believed it was over. The gate stood undisturbed, the letters stopped coming, and the neighborhood felt peaceful. But I should have known better. Karen's ego couldn't handle public humiliation. One night, around midnight, I was woken by the sound of metal clanking outside. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out my bedroom window. Two figures were at the gate, one of them unmistakably Tyler. The other was Karen, holding what looked like a bolt cutter. My stomach dropped. They were trying to break the lock. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and called the police. I stayed inside but kept filming as the two struggled with the chain. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, the headlights caught them red-handed. Karen froze, her face pale, in the glare. Tyler tried to run but slipped on the wet grass. The officers detained both of them on the spot. I walked down my driveway calmly, phone still recording, and said, "You really should have stopped when you had the chance." As the officers questioned them, Karen babbled excuses, something about checking for safety hazards and community access inspections. The cops didn't buy it. They took statements, reviewed my footage, and by the end of the night, she was issued a citation for trespassing and property damage. Tyler got one, too. Watching the two of them stand there, defeated and humiliated under flashing lights, was oddly satisfying. I knew it wasn't over legally. Karen would find a way to spin this. But it was a turning point. The gate had become more than just metal and hinges. It was a line in the sand, a boundary between what was mine and what they couldn't control. And I had no intention of letting them cross it again. The night Karen and Tyler were caught trying to cut my gate, lock spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By morning, everyone in Willow Creek Estates knew what had happened. Someone had even uploaded a snippet of my video to the community Facebook page, Karen's furious expression illuminated in police headlights, bolt cutter in hand, while Tyler stood beside her looking like a scolded child. The comments were brutal. Neighbors who once bowed to her authority were openly mocking her. "So much for community leadership," one person wrote. Another posted, "Guess we finally know who the real nuisance is." By the time noon rolled around, the HOA board had called an emergency session to discuss conduct unbecoming of board members. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. Several residents texted me updates in real time. Apparently, Karen tried to blame me for setting her up and accused the police of being biased. But when the president asked why she was at my property with bolt cutters at midnight, she had no answer. The board voted to suspend her position pending investigation. It was poetic justice. For the first time in years, people in the neighborhood felt free to speak without fear of reprisal. But Karen wasn't done. 2 days later, I received a formal notice. She was filing a civil complaint against me for defamation, harassment, and emotional distress. It would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. My attorney, Jennifer, smirked when she read it. Classic deflection, she said. "She's hoping to scare you into dropping your claim." But I wasn't backing down. We counterfiled with our own lawsuit, citing harassment, trespassing, property damage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and when the day came, the courtroom was packed. Half the HOA seemed to have shown up to watch. Karen strutted in wearing an expensive suit and a smug expression, while Tyler slouched behind her in a hoodie, trying to look invisible. Her lawyer, a sharp-tongued man who looked like he billed by the insult, started off by painting me as a hostile neighbor who used social media to publicly humiliate a respected community leader. When it was Jennifer's turn, she calmly slid a binder across the table to the judge. Inside were property maps, the deed, photos of my private drive, signs, screenshots of Karen's emails, and, of course, the video footage of her attempting to cut my lock. The courtroom was silent as the video played. The judge's brow furrowed. When it ended, Jennifer said, evenly, "Your Honor, this is the plaintiff on camera committing trespass and vandalism on private property." Karen's face turned red, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't decide whether to speak or melt into her chair. Her lawyer tried to object, claiming context was missing, but the judge wasn't having it. "Context doesn't excuse breaking and entering," he said dryly. Then came the kicker. Jennifer introduced a county assessor's report confirming that my property was not under HOA jurisdiction and that the association had indeed misrepresented its authority for years. The judge turned to Karen, his tone suddenly cold. "Mrs. Johnson, it appears you and your HOA acted outside the bounds of your charter. Not only that, but your repeated contact and interference with Mr. Rogers' property constitute harassment." She stammered something about community safety, but he cut her off. "That's no excuse for criminal behavior." The verdict was swift. The case was dismissed in my favor, and Karen was ordered to pay damages and legal fees. But the best part came when the judge turned to address the HOA representatives present. "You might want to review your governance structure," he said pointedly, "before this becomes a class action." After the hearing, I walked out into the sunlight feeling lighter than I had in months. Reporters from a local outlet had caught wind of the story and were waiting outside. One of them asked, "Mr. Rogers, how does it feel to take down your HOA?" I laughed. "I didn't take them down," I said. "They did that themselves. I just held up the mirror." Within days, the story hit the news under the headline, "Homeowner wins against overreaching HOA after president charged with trespassing." Karen's name was plastered all over local social media, and her reputation, once untouchable, crumbled overnight. Tyler left town soon after, supposedly moving in with relatives to get away from the drama. The HOA board voted to remove Karen permanently, dissolved several of her bogus policies, and issued a public apology to the community for overstepping boundaries. As for me, I finally enjoyed the peace I'd been fighting for. My gate remained locked, not to keep people out, but to remind me that boundaries matter, both physical and personal. Every time I walked past it, I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet victory. A few weeks later, one of my neighbors, Mark, the guy who'd once been fined for having an unauthorized mailbox, stopped by with a beer. "You know," he said, "you didn't just win for yourself. You won for all of us." I smiled, clinking my bottle with his. "Maybe, but I'd rather we all just learn to mind our own business." We both laughed, watching the sunset over the quiet street that used to buzz with tension. A month later, I received one last envelope from the HOA, not a fine this time, but a formal letter of apology signed by the newly elected president. They'd revised their bylaws to clearly outline jurisdiction and property rights. It even included a line thanking me for bringing attention to necessary reforms. I couldn't help but grin. Life in Willow Creek Estates was finally calm. Karen's old house went up for sale shortly after. The listing described it as a quiet, well-managed neighborhood property. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sometimes, all it takes to expose entitlement is a single locked gate, and the courage to stand firm behind it. In the end, the battle wasn't just about a fence or a padlock. It was about the right to live without being bullied by people who think authority equals ownership. I learned that standing your ground doesn't always mean yelling the loudest. It means knowing when to fight smart, when to let the evidence speak, and when to let karma do its work. Karen learned that too, though far too late. Because while gates can be rebuilt, reputations, once shattered, stay locked out forever.